Well, I hadn't thought a lot about babies, and a friend of mine said, let's write a history of babies together. And she ended up not doing the book with me, but we began to realize that babies have been written out of history. We have children's history now, we have history of adolescence, we have of course, most history about adults. But when we started to look at babies, or when I started to look at babies, I realized that they're such drivers of modernization in the 20th century. They took ordinary American families, not the elites in the wealthy neighborhoods of New York or out in California making movies, but just ordinary Americans, and helped bring them into consumer culture, into practicing with modern medical techniques to raise infants. It taught people a lot about psychology. People didn't go and read Freud, but they read some baby books that taught them about the kind of the inner lives of babies and how to interact with them. So I realized babies have this wonderful, rich history, and nobody had written about them. I think the thing that surprised me the most, and perhaps I was naive, but I'm not an economist, and just how tied in babies were to the marketplace. They made their families spend money, of course. They acted as sales babies and promoted all kinds of products. They were a government investment with the Children's Bureau and then with the various legislation to help support them. But more importantly, I think the thing that surprised me the most is how much people either paid to give away unwanted babies, if they didn't just outright abandon them, and how much people paid to buy babies that they wanted to adopt. They really are consumer items and consumer discards at various points in our history. So I sort of had to teach myself a lot of economics to understand the relationship of babies to the marketplace. Yes, they did. Babies really did make us modern. And I'll give you some examples. We started to talk about what is the role of government, the federal government, in the lives of the American public. We had obviously we had an agricultural department because we wanted farmers to raise healthy food and feed Americans. But then we get, as early as 1912, the United States Children's Bureau, because in a sense we want to raise healthy children. We want to raise babies who are brought up with modern scientific medical ways. And the federal government really reaches into the nurseries of millions and millions and millions of Americans and teaches them very simple things. How to feed your babies safely, how to avoid germs in the nursery, when to call the doctor or the nurse when your baby is sick. So all of that information, in a sense, babies connect us to the big federal government, and Americans love that. They wrote hundreds of thousands of letters to the Children's Bureau asking for advice. Babies connected us to the marketplace for ordinary American families with limited incomes, maybe on farms with limited cash. Babies might be the first things they invested in. They bought clothes for babies instead of making them at home after a time. They bought formula for babies if their infants couldn't nurse. And they opened bank accounts for their babies because banks and insurance companies spent a lot of money advertising, saying, invest in your baby's future. And as infant mortality rates fell, Americans did just that. They bought policies for their babies. Some baby books even had perforated deposit slips, so you could start opening a bank account for babies, and when babies were born, people started giving them savings bonds and money. Well, babies were wonderful sales babies. They sell wonderful things. So in times of war, of course, babies were in posters about protect our infants, our women and children, but they were also very effective at selling Liberty bonds in World War I and in savings bonds in World War II. So the cover of a magazine called Congratulations, given out in hospitals to new moms, had a picture of a baby with a Series E bond. And, you know, I don't know that people bought savings bonds because the babies were so cute, but the government certainly thought that they would be good salespeople for those bonds. Incubator shows begin in the United States at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, Nebraska at the very end of the 19th century. And people lined up, paid a quarter to walk in and see babies in these sort of glass and metal boxes. And I had to think hard about why people would want to do that. After all, the birth rate was high, there were babies all around us. But there was something about the struggle against death with this scientific equipment, maybe not so exotic for people who came off farms and hatched poultry in incubators, but exotic still for little infants. And people love going to the incubator shows. So they open up as commercial enterprises. There's one that's an infantorium on the Wonderland Amusement Park in Minnesota. Just about every World's Fair that opens up has an incubator show. And it's really only in the 20s and more in the 30s that they become standard hospital equipment. Incubators are expensive to operate. You need trained nurses, you need to clean the incubators, make sure there are no germs. So it's very expensive for a hospital to maintain them. Whereas if the paying guests are coming in and paying a quarter to see the babies, then you can afford to run the incubator shows. And what I found interesting is I read that a lot of times women would come in and sort of have a favorite baby and would come back again and again to see their same baby in the incubator. And but people did grow cynical about them, and my favorite story about that is there was a young boy who stood outside the incubator show at the 1939-1940 World's Fair in New York City saying, it's a ruse, don't go in there, they don't do any tricks, they just sleep. So I guess they lost their place as a command performance at a World's Fair. The most fascinating thing I found about adoption were two things really. One, adoption went from being something where you wanted an older child who you could put to work a little bit and maybe you were sure of the background and their personality and their health, to something different where we wanted to adopt babies. And what we get by the mid-1950s is a black market baby buying system. A lot of infants were, of course, adopted or went to relatives when their families couldn't take care of them. But there was a whole underground market for babies. People would go to Canada and buy babies. People would go to sort of maternity homes and buy babies. It involved doctors, it involved lawyers, it involved judges, it involved brokers. Some of it was criminal activity, and I think the most fascinating thing I found about that was an article about a New York City gangster group that made most of their money in the black market babies, and sort of gambling was their secondary source of income. So people wanted babies. By the post-World War II period, people wanted to adopt infants. There weren't enough. And we have the rise of this black market. So again, it's about economics in babies. Very, very interesting. I will say left out of that, of course, are non-Euro-American babies and disabled babies. And their history is very different, and I do try and talk about that throughout the book. One of the joys of writing this book was discovering a collection of baby books at the UCLA Biomedical Library. Every day, the wonderful archivist there gets on eBay and buys baby books, not the beautiful ones by artists that are brand new and quite expensive, but the ones that have been filled in and somehow discarded and ending up for sale. And they're just filled with information about the actual lives of babies. And as I started reading them, I found it just fascinating because you could really see American history unfold in there, in the kinds of questions they asked about how to bring up babies, the infant routines, weighing, measuring, diet, in the list of things you need to buy for your babies, again, all about consumer culture, in the development of infant psychology when they ask you to not just write down the first words, but does the baby follow an object with her eyes, that kind of thing. And also how parenting practices change. And two of the things I found most interesting were Early baby books used to have a place where you entered all the little accidents your babies had. Did they fall out of the high chair? Did they fall down and break an arm? And mothers would dutifully fill that in. Oh, he fell down and was carrying a glass and broke it, and the glass got in his hand. After World War II, we don't ask those questions anymore, and we don't fill them in anymore. And in the same way, they had a place for baby's first discipline, and mothers would write, well, I slapped baby for pulling on the Davenport pringe, or baby wouldn't stop doing this, so I had to spank baby. And now we don't ask those questions. I don't think that babies stopped having accidents. I don't think they stopped getting little swats. But it really shows us how American culture has changed, because we don't ask those questions anymore.